So my congratulations to EDS once again for a terrific program, and thanks very much for including me in it. As PCE, I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about and living with land use change. I'm from rural New Zealand. I just drove up this morning from Ngāruawā here, and I've written several reports about it. The first was released in 2019 with another major synthesis released last year, along with 2 in-depth case studies about Southland and Northland. And finally, I've just released a report on forestry in New Zealand entitled ALF Reset, Examining the Drivers of Forestry in New Zealand. If you want to ask me a question about why we called it that, you can. In the 15 minutes you've allotted me, I'm going to condense some key findings into a few brief points. And if you're interested in more detail, take a look at the full reports on the PCE website. The first point, which is obvious but worth stating, is that land use change is the norm in New Zealand. It's driven by both economic forces and policy settings, and will in future also be driven by climate change. Now, in recent years, 2 key trends have emerged. This always happens. How can we get this to advance? Sorry, I have never yet, at the OECD, at the UN, in the New Zealand Parliament, here, never, ever, ever had a ride where these things worked reliably. This shows the change of land use to pasture between 1996 and 2016. So that's one trend of land use change. And the other, more recently, is the conversion of sheep and beef country to forestry. Now, the move to forestry was initially driven by simple economics. Sheep and beef farming had become marginal, while production, pine forestry, was more profitable. However, current settings under the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme have effectively supercharged the conversion to forestry through a new economic incentive: permanent pine forests planted to offset fossil fuel emissions. Unsurprisingly, many wondered why these permanent forests couldn't be native. And the Climate Commission reinforced those hopes by publishing a demonstration pathway that envisaged roughly 30,000 hectares of natives being planted annually by 2035, in addition to similar areas of new exotic afforestation. 35,000 hectares a year of natives is a very large number, and that's actually what sparked my forestry inquiry. I wanted answers to some key questions. Was native afforestation at the scale projected practically achievable? Was the spread of radiata pine as bad for New Zealand as some were claiming? Now, my report, this is the ALT Reset one, lays out the answers in some detail, but here are a few of the key findings in brief. Firstly, native afforestation at scale has many benefits, but it's a challenging and expensive undertaking, and one that takes decades to centuries to bring to fruition. The biggest barrier to its success is our lack of knowledge about how to go about it. We're trying to recreate native forests in an environment which is very different from the one in which native forests originally grew. Animal pests, weeds, disease, land use change, and now climate change itself make the recreation of resilient, self-perpetuating native forests very challenging. Secondly, production forestry isn't the villain that it is sometimes made out to be. Sited appropriately and managed well, it provides a sound economic return and local employment. Production forest can offer environmental benefits, just like any forest can, but there are also risks that make it unsuitable in some places. Importantly, though, Because production forests are managed for profit, there are strong incentives to at least manage them and the land on which they are sited. Permanent carbon forests are another matter. Because, let's be clear, to offset long-lived carbon emissions, these forests must remain there effectively forever. They must be maintained and protected against fire, disease, pests and severe weather events forever. This can't be guaranteed. Losing the carbon stored in them will be increasingly likely as a changing climate brings wildfires and severe weather events in its wake. The other question that's been largely ignored in the current debate is, how will the long-term maintenance of carbon forests be funded when the flow of carbon credits begins to slow or indeed dries up? And if forest owners don't maintain their forests, will taxpayers be expected to carry the can for management costs or carbon liabilities? But there's a more fundamental issue here. So fundamental I have to click twice. Allowing forestry offsets in the NZETS has set up a situation where if we continue to emit carbon dioxide and fail to reduce gross emissions, we will need to plant more and more forests. And this will lock up more and more land in carbon forestry, effectively removing future land use options and further disrupting rural communities. We are committing future generations to maintaining a much larger forestry estate in a much warmer world. Now, I'm proposing what I see as the simplest solution to this problem, and that is phase forestry offsets out of the ETS. This would mean that no additional forest would be registered. Okay, forests that were already registered could be grandfathered over time, but the diminishing supply of forestry units would eventually drive carbon prices up, and that would drive gross emissions down, which is exactly what an ETS is supposed to do. We just don't let ours do that. We could instead harness climate policy to drive positive land use change. A rising carbon price would likely lead to increased revenue from auctions, which could then be used to fund native afforestation initiatives in the areas that need it most, such as areas with highly erodible soils or whenua Māori. I have to say, as a fossil fuel user, I like the idea of having to pay to undo some of the past damage we've wreaked on our landscape. I actually think it is a very saleable political proposition. Another option is to use afforestation to mitigate the warming effects of agricultural methane emissions. I've suggested creating a separate ETS to manage biogenic methane that allows for forestry offsets as part of the response. I believe this is respectable because, unlike permanent carbon forestry, forestry offsets from production forestry are better matched to shorter-lived methane emissions if you take a warming approach. And it would also mean that the people who live and work on the land are closer to managing their own emissions by deciding where and how forests are established. Now, the government signalled in the last couple of weeks that it has no plans to remove forestry from the ETS. That's the response to my report. I'm not surprised by this short-run response. I think I'd have probably given that response if I'd been the minister, because it would involve a very significant change, not one you'd make without carefully preparing the ground and thinking it through. But we do need to think it through because the issue can't be avoided. Successive governments have not wanted to confront the consequences of treating forestry as a get-out-of-jail-free card for dealing with our emissions. And as a result, they and future generations have a tiger by the tail. Modelling from various sources suggests that forestry offsets will eventually place the long-term viability of the New Zealand emissions trading scheme at risk. It shows that in the mid-2030s, a glut of forestry units in the ETS will cause the price to start falling, leaving us with a scheme that can deliver neither tree planting nor emissions reductions. This will undermine our ability to meet our climate targets. But if a low price leads to ongoing emissions, we'll have to start planting trees again, won't we? And we'll need to keep the ETS going forever just to ensure we retain the existing stock of forestry in perpetuity. Just think about that. Now, if the government doesn't plan to reform the ETS, then at the very least, it should review the permanent forest category. The rules and expectations around permanent forests need to be clearer and focused on the longer term to account for the risk that once the flow of carbon credits slows, there may be little incentive for owners to continue to manage their forests. I mentioned earlier that owners of production forests do have continued incentives to manage their forests well in the long run. However, the impacts from Cyclone Gabrielle in Tairāwhiti have shown that this does not always happen. For this reason, my forest report recommends better management of environmental risks from production forests. The first is to ban clear fell harvesting in high-risk areas. And to do that, we need to do the work to identify those areas. The second is for the Ministry for the Environment to investigate ways to ensure that forestry companies cover the costs of the environmental damage they cause. These would need to be enforced through revised regulation, taking responsibility for the negative environmental effects of production forestry should be part of the cost of doing business. Otherwise, we're choosing to degrade the environment further. Now, if New Zealand wants to encourage different types of forests, other than pine, then a number of barriers stand in the way. Firstly, we simply don't know as much about alternative forestry systems as we do about the conventional radiata pine regime, in which we've now invested 3 human generations of both research and practical learning by doing. And these unknowns make investing in alternative forests a risky proposition. I've suggested that we make filling these information gaps a research priority and that we bring together all of the currently available information to make it easily accessible. There are also some regulatory barriers that could be lifted to encourage alternative forestry systems. I've recommended a review of the Forest Act 1949 that has elements that disincentivise owners from regenerating native forests, and also how councils treat native timber harvest. I've also suggested changes to the way our building standards are set and reviewed to remove barriers to greater use of alternative species timber. Things are a bit stacked against the alternatives. Now, my forest report makes a good case for the diversification of our forestry estate, but I deliberately didn't recommend that. And that's because I believe that ultimately the decisions about what works best for the land, whether it be exotic or native afforestation, changes to land management approaches, or full-scale land use change, must be made by those closest to the land. This approach to environmental management, detailed in Going with the Grain, proposes that central and regional levels of government determine what the desired environmental goals are and the outcome should be, and that's not a voluntary matter, in consultation with communities, but then how those goals and outcomes are actually achieved should be led and driven by landowners, local communities and mana whenua through collectives like catchment groups. Standardising from the centre is too blunt a tool to account for the variations across our landscapes and will potentially impose unnecessary costs. Indeed, I worry that current resource management reforms are placing too much faith in the ability to deal with everything through standardised national templates. In Going with the Grain, I argued that the catchment and sub-catchment level is the logical scale for environmental management. Currently, we issue national level decrees about what should happen, And then we try to get someone to enforce that at the level of a property. Environmental issues don't map neatly onto property boundaries. Without cooperation from neighbours and others sharing the same catchment, individuals can have only a limited impact on addressing environmental issues like freshwater quality and biodiversity loss. The layers you see here are for the northeastern part of the northern Wairoa catchment, which drains into the Kaipara. That sort of information is not available over much of New Zealand. But what that stacking of layers suggests is that E. coli susceptibility as a result of land use and as a result of our qualities of our land is more in some places than others. And if you can see all those black lines, those are the cadastral boundaries. That's the property boundaries. So we didn't tell the environment about that. We just covered it in lines. And then we've said, oh, well, whoever manages this rectangle will do X. But X, unfortunately, extends over the boundary. And you could do this map for N, you could do this for P, you could do this for sediment, you could do it for biodiversity. We're trying to come up with an overall outcome, apply it at the property level. We've got to find a way of getting people to work collectively across property boundaries to do stuff and to incentivise them. And there's some very, very good stuff happening in some collectives around New Zealand, but they're surviving on the smell of an oily rag. Okay, a final point to make is that any changes we make to rural land use must be well informed and based on good quality information, hence these layers. Everyone making environmental decisions, regulators and regulated alike, should have access to high quality environmental information. This is an investment, I think, that the government should make, and it should be freely available as a public good. Currently, people are paying for information that taxpayers paid to gather long ago. Trying to piece together multiple bits of geospatially specific data and find the gaps is a major quest. I put it to the government that this is a challenge it cannot dodge if it wants to continue with its reforms. Those reforms will fail without it. And if you look at my website, you'll find a letter that I just signed off 2 weeks ago to 4 ministers saying we desperately need to federate a highly fragmented data ecosystem, information ecosystem that underlies environmental management in New Zealand. So I'm hopeful that someone will listen. Thank you. I'm happy to elaborate further on any of these points.